I finally got around to seeing Hereditary and I really enjoyed it. I pretty much know what to expect at this point from A24 horror films, and I don't really let the trailers mislead me. This movie was pretty damn messed up and definitely deserves a comparison to Exorcist. There are a few things that really surprised me with this film. For one, the soundtrack was extremely well done and very eerie. It definitely added to the creepy tone and elevated this film's horror factor for me. Millie Shapiro steals the show as Charlie. She's a creepy, unnerving child and has by far the most shocking scene in a very shocking movie. The entire cast actually does a pretty good job and the characters are actually convincing. It's rare to actually care about characters in a horror film, but Hereditary does a good job making everyone at the very least likable. Finally, I love how this film is shot. The camera work and color especially stand out to me as well done. I wasn't a real big fan of the day to night transitions. I know it might sound nitpicky, but it just reminded me of something like a student film would have. Whenever it happened, it took me out of it a little bit, but, it's fine, whatever. Obviously, I don't want to delve further into this film yet because that's spoilers, so after the verdict, I'll discuss it further. Overall, Hereditary was genuinely creepy and unnerving. It's probably the creepiest movie I've seen in the last 5 years. I was uncomfortable throughout the film, and there was many times where I caught myself not breathing. And while I'm excited to see it again, I never want to see this fucking movie again for as long as I live. I'm giving Hereditary an 8 out of 10. Okay, now I'm going to talk spoilers, so if you haven't seen Hereditary yet, go ahead and click off this video, and thank you for watching. So, as it turns out, this is one of those cult movies. No, not like an underground success, but an actual satanic cult is involved. The film practically spells it out for you with various shots having the cult symbol on it, and it leaves you to sort of piece together the film for yourself. I like this type of film, but I feel like Hereditary was pretty heavy-handed with its subtleties, so I guess they weren't all that subtle. The scariest parts of this film for me were just how many times something was out of focus, or in the background or covered in darkness. The film never really pointed out most of them, they were just sort of there, and if you notice them, congrats, it's burned into your brain now. That grandma! The mom banging her head on the cellar door near the end was super freaky, but the scare before it was kind of lame and it took me out of it a bit. The possessed mom pops out of the darkness and makes a monster sound. It was so obviously overdubbed and it made it sound super weird. There's a belief out there that if something isn't scary without you adding a sound effect to make it scary, the original video probably isn't all that scary, so I feel like this was a very similar situation here. The cult members standing outside of the house throughout the entire movie was super weird and it really got to me. The film just felt so real. The house that they were living in wasn't some creepy old abandoned house that absolutely nobody would live in. It was just a nice house. The horror comes from everything outside or inside the house, but not so much the house itself. I know this may not seem like a really big deal, but it actually is because it elevates the horror because, the house isn't creaky and broken down and dark and ugly. It's everything else around it. People are talking about how convenient Charlie's death was for the cult. Like, it couldn't have been planned that way, it's way too accidental, but you have to keep in mind that there's supernatural forces at large here, and her death was foreshadowed twice in the film. Once when she cuts off the pigeon's head, and it also foreshadows the ritual and implies that Charlie is possessed and being influenced, and the second time at the party when they're smoking weed, they're watching a video of a decapitation on the TV. It's implied that the members of the cult have been watching this family from the very beginning. So it isn't super far-fetched to assume they planned Charlie's death to work out that way. Also, fun fact, Paimon, the devil who they're trying to summon, is the demon prince of wisdom and foresight, so that kind of helps too. Speaking of Charlie, I'm convinced that she was never ever Charlie and was actually Paimon for the entirety of the film. I already mentioned the pigeon. The figures she makes are very similar to figures you see in Joan's house near the end of the film, when Charlie possesses her mom, you can hear how she originally sounds, which is more innocent and afraid sounding. Also, at the end of the film, you hear the cult members talking about how their original host was insufficient. Charlie's tongue click, which is somehow really freaky, actually had some significance. That's how Paimon's language comes across for human interpretation, and when Peter gets possessed at the end of the film, he does that exact same clicking sound. My absolute favorite scene in the entire film is Charlie's death. Well, not the fact that she died, but because when it happens, the theater I was in went completely silent. And Peter did a magnificent job portraying shock and disbelief for what just happened. He lays in bed and doesn't sleep. It slowly fades from day to night. He just lays in bed and sits there in disbelief at what just happened. He doesn't sleep. It slowly fades to daytime, where we hear the mother and father talking, and the mother just walks out the door and freaks the hell out. Toni Collette does an absolutely amazing job showing loss and grief and mourning, and it just cuts to a shot of Charlie's severed head with ants all over it. Once again, leaving an image just burned into your head. I suppose I'll talk about how weird this movie gets near the end now. So the goal of this cult is to summon their evil god Payman and bring them endless riches and wisdom. However, they need 3 sacrifices via decapitation and a male host. The grandma that dies in the beginning of the film is sacrifice number 1. Charlie is number 2, and finally the mom is number 3. In a scene that is absolutely horrifying, by the way, she gets decapitated. Peter is the male host for this devil, so I interpreted this family as just doomed from the beginning. Specifically Charlie. The grandma always had an attachment to her the moment she was born and demanded that she herself feed Charlie. This, to me, was Grandma offering Charlie to Payman. Charlie mentions that Grandma always wanted her to be a boy. This, to me, means that Grandma didn't want to sacrifice Charlie and wanted her to be the host. People were questioning the naked cult members and asking why they were naked. I just understand that it's a common thing with cults. It's a whole thing with sin and black magic and nakedness, and it's whatever. Now, a few people pointed out that you can actually see Peter's classmates and teacher at the ritual near the end of the film, which is just nuts to me. It explains why the cult was seemingly always one step ahead of this family. Even if for some people it isn't a good enough explanation, at least it wasn't the, oh, they just won't notice route. So, after Peter witnesses those traumatic events, he jumps out of the window, which is a homage to The Exorcist, by the way, and it appears that there's a change in his character. He seems far less afraid and more accepting of things. Sure, he's traumatized and he doesn't really look the same, but this to me meant that Payman finally won control over Peter and was ready to finally be unleashed. By the end of the film, we no longer saw Peter being terrorized by a cult. We see a cult worshipping their successfully summoned demonic king. Anyway, this is just my interpretation of the film, and there's probably tons of other interpretations out there. Hereditary is one of those films that I feel like will be talked about for several years. It's one of the most detailed and interesting movies I've seen, and also one of the most creepy and unnerving films I've ever seen. Sure, it wasn't received well by most audiences, but I believe they'll come around. This film definitely deserves the comparisons to The Exorcist, and it's one of the great horror movies of our generation. Once again, I'm giving Hereditary an 8 out of 10. Also, by the way, fuck summer movie horror audiences. The theater that I was in was extremely obnoxious and just, goddamn guys, like, just go there and enjoy a movie. Get off your fucking phone. And stop doing that goddamn clicking sound. You're not funny. You're being super fucking annoying. It's a good movie though.